over this semester and year about difficult conversations and how to approach difficult topics in the media. So this will be recording this session just so everyone knows. And thank you so much to our three guests who are here today. I'll give them a chance to introduce them. I'll give a little introduction and chance to introduce themselves. And then I will have a couple of questions that our Daily Iowan Diversity, Equity, Inclusion team came up with about the topic, which is reporting on sensitive topics and having difficult conversations. And then we will have a period of time where we'll open it up to the audience for questions and anyone else who'd like to ask our panelists a question. So let's see. All right, well, welcome. So, okay, so our three guests today, so Courtney Crowder, who's the Iowa columnist at the Des Moines Register. She tells human stories with an investigative eye and narrative touch. She's a graduate of New York University and previously worked at the Chicago Tribune. Most recently, she worked on the Iowa Moines project. And we have Tabitha Wiggins. She's the University of Iowa's interim director for the Center for Diversity and Enrichment. And up until this year, she directed the Multicultural International Student Support Services. Thank you so much for being here. And then we also have Barry Schreier, who's the director of University of Iowa's Counseling Services. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I guess I will just give you guys each a chance to go around and just say, introduce yourself a little bit more. If there's anything else you'd like to add or want the group to know about you, take just like a couple minutes to introduce yourselves. We can start with Tab.
Cool. So yeah, I've been at the institution since 2011. So I'm going on 10 years. So that's pretty exciting. I'm originally from the city of Chicago. And I say that purposefully because a lot of folks say they're from Chicago, but I'm actually from the city, the South Side. And so that informs a lot of who I am and my lens, to be quite honest. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I've enjoyed my work with the Daily Iowan throughout the years, and specifically with Marissa, who has graduated. It was great to see her grow with the organization and with the newspaper as well. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. Awesome. Courtney.
Hi, I'm Courtney Crowder. I'm the Iowa columnist at the Des Moines Register, which is a job that goes back to World War II. 5 people have held that job, and I'm the first woman to have it. So there's a good thing that happened in 2020. I came to this through features, so I never worked breaking news, though I did my fair share of pulls on the shift. I came to the job through the entertainment sphere, and I think that forms a lot of how I interact with sources. And we'll talk about that today, but thanks so much for having me.
Barry.
Okay, hi everybody, and hi to Courtney and Tab. So I'm Barry Schreier, and I am the director of the University Counseling Service. I'm also on faculty in the doctoral program in counseling psychology, which is over in the College of Education. So those are 2 hats that I wear on this campus. I've been here at Iowa. I'm in my 6th year, so not nearly as long as Tab. I actually didn't know that. That's actually great to know. Congratulations. I've made my entire career in campus mental health, and previously I've been at the University of Connecticut, Princeton, and Purdue prior to being here. I hold minority identities. I identify as gay, and I also identify as Jewish. And often I always think that I'm the only gay Jew on campus. And that actually may be true here. We'll see. It may not be true. It's hard to know. I also too have always really enjoyed my interactions with the Daily Iowan, and I would certainly echo what Tab said about Marissa and sort of watching. I remember when she first came as a young new reporter trying to figure out how to get her tape recorder to work. And then before I turned around, she was the editor of the paper, which was, was really cool and good for her. But always have really enjoyed my interactions with the Daily Iowan, which I can't say about every campus newspaper that I've had interactions with. So kudos to you all. And this is not the first time that I've sat in sort of a forum like this with you all, as you ask all really good, depthful questions about how to really be the best newspaper you can be. So thank you for that opportunity again.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here. And with that, I'll dive into a couple questions. Just as a reminder, I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the larger group as far as anything that you guys might want to ask. If there's anything that you want to ask in the meantime or clarify, feel free to throw a question in the chat and I'll get to it and ask as we're asking questions as well. And then we'll be able to open it up at the end. So our first question, let's see here. So what are some best practices for approaching individuals or reaching out to individuals who've experienced a traumatic event or are in emotional distress? You can go ahead in the same order if we want to start with Tab.
And you're asking in sort of the context of being a reporter, yes?
Yes, in the context of being a reporter. If we're oftentimes news events such as talking about deaths, sudden events, things such as if there is some kind of racist graffiti on campus. Obviously, these are all very difficult topics that we need to report on or may need to report on. And so if there is ever a time where we need to, for approaching individuals or even an appropriate time to reach out, if there is an appropriate time to reach out during events like this.
Yeah, I think this is a great question and something for you all to be thinking about. Something that I've always appreciated about, and I refer to Marissa quite a bit probably because I've just worked with her, but was her intention and her ability to get to know the community outside of the job. And so if you are a part of a community or a community doesn't feel as if you're being voyeuristic, they're much more open to, discussing these types of issues with you. And specifically, I think about my work with students when I was with the cultural centers. I would hear over and over again, the Daily Iowan would only come in when there's an issue or there's a problem, or they wanted to hear about, any of those things, but they wouldn't come to our programs. They wouldn't break bread with us. And so if you have relationship and community with folks, they would be much more open to having those conversations when, a traumatic event potentially has happened. And I also that, when we have, let's say you said racist graffiti on campus, I think it's really interesting how we go to communities of color immediately and try to get the pulse from them. But I would be interested to hear what white folks thought about that, and I think that would be a new way of really engaging the public in something that is so, harmful to our community. Because it can be re-traumatizing for communities of color over and over to have to talk about their experience with these things that happen throughout campus, nationally. There's just a re-traumatization that continues to occur. And so to avoid that, I just wonder if there's a other way for us to start to think about it.
Definitely.
So same question, I assume, Sarah?
Yes, yep.
Okay. So I think I thought of this, being in the community when it's not just a tragedy and thinking of new angles, as Tabitha said, are amazing tips. Probably the preeminent is you think about going into journalism. I thought of the question as I prepared more from almost an assignment basis, like you're gonna do it. And from that perspective, you have to be a human first and a reporter second, every time, always. number one, you make a sincere, underline, and honest, underline, connection before you move to your ask. And sometimes those are happening in the same Facebook message or in the same voicemail message or in the same email. But you start with, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. Maybe if you're that kind of person, I've added you to my daily devotions. Maybe you've experienced the same thing and you can bring that up, or maybe you can't even imagine what that feels like, and you can say something like that. You do not say that everything will be okay or that they are surviving. Do not put your own opinion of how a result should be in that, but you just make an honest connection based on your lived experience. I'm so sorry, this has happened to me. And then I am hoping that you will tell me your story. And you make that connection honestly and sincerely. And you just ask them, I mean, do you want to talk to me? Do you want to tell your story? Are you ready to chat? I think sometimes, especially movies and J school also sometimes falls into this trap of thinking of ways around or under things, or how we get to things from different angles. But when you're doing this kind of long form features reporting, this kind of narrative reporting, there's no way to go about it but to hit it head on. And I think being honest and sincere about your connection with a person and about what you're asking is the way to go about it. The second part of your question was also about timing. Timing is harder because if you are a breaking news reporter, the answer is you got to make that call right now. I mean, there's no question about waiting to reach out to a victim. That's the reality of news. Now we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the reality of news. And I think if you approach it with honesty and sincerity, you might still get hung up on, you might still get yelled at, but ultimately asking a question, asking if someone's ready, is something that I'm not willing to say is the wrong thing to do. And it's the reality of the job. If you're a features writer or you, for some reason, have some space, I would think about when someone might be most ready to read your email. And I mean that emotionally for the victim, of course, but I also mean that for you. You know, the 5 o'clock news deadline is 4:30. You probably maybe don't send your Facebook message, your request in the afternoon. Maybe you can wait till the morning. And maybe that's going to be a different time. They're going to be more ready to see it, or they'll just see it because their Facebook message inbox has been flooded by other media. So for me, the best way to approach this is with an open heart and with honesty and sincerity about what you're asking from them.
Yeah. Do you have an example of a time that you've had to do that?
Yeah. So last year, 2 years ago, there was a home baker, someone who bakes at home and sells those cookies and cakes in Burlington, Iowa, and a person posed as a customer to gain access to her home and then raped her. And it picked up a little virality online. Some people were sharing that story in an effort to raise money for her. And so I wrote a Facebook message, I would say the day after I saw it picking up speed online. And I said, Justina, my name is Courtney Crowder. I'm so sorry for what has happened to you. I have never experienced that, but I've experienced tragedy in my life. And I can tell you that telling our story frees us. If you are ready to talk, I'm ready to hear. I'm ready to listen. And she replied, like most victims do, you know, give me a call. I'll talk to you off the record. Give me a call. Or I'm not ready yet, but shoot me a text. And so I know she told me that she had sent that same message, I'll talk to you off the record, to 3 different people. And I'm the only one who called her. And we talked off the record for 2 hours. And that's a lot of time in the news business. We talked off the record for 2 hours. And by the time that we finished, we had created a connection based on, you know, our love for the Cubs. And we cried together and we shared of experiences that we had. And I went with her and had a 4-hour interview the next day.
No, thank you for sharing that. Barry, do you want me to repeat the question or?
No, I got the question. The dilemma is going third after two really smart people. It sort of doesn't leave much additional to say, but that's good. You've heard from two really sort of plugged in folks who have given, I think, really good feedback. You know, I would sort of just in shorter form, just highlight a couple of things, particularly that Courtney said to start, which is offer choice. I think when we approach folks who are not savvy with the press, it comes across as not a choice and I have to talk to you. And that's simply not the case. And I have been approached by reporters numerous times with like microphone in my face and the camera running. And I'm like, I feel the wherewithal and the privilege to say to you, I don't want to talk to you, but not everybody does. And so offering that as choice, that you can speak or not speak with me if you'd like. I think Courtney said, you know, validate the human in front of you. I think that's such an important thing. Otherwise, I think sometimes it can come across as predatory. And I know that's not the intent of the paper or of the media per se. But again, unless I feel sort of validated and I have an understanding of why you're asking me the question and how you talking to me not only benefits you, but how you think it benefits me, makes it feel a lot less predatory to me, that there's some payoff to me to talk to you. And Courtney kind of gave some explanation of like one way to say that, which is, you know, telling your story helps free us, which is a really great way to say it. The other thing is be thoughtful, and Tab talked about this too, which is I often get contacted by media folks who say like, I need to talk to you today by 4. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll try to make it happen. But boy, when I reach out to you with something, silence. And I have to tell you, it adds up really quickly for me is I know who the reporters are who respond to me when I want something and those who don't. And those who consistently don't respond to me but ask me for information by 4 today, you stop hearing from me eventually as well. And it's because you're not joining me in my community. It simply feels like you want something and there's no relationship there. And I think those are really important things. And then the last thing I would say, you know, around things like racist writings or, you know, violence in our community based on any sort of number of reasons, I think I read reports and what I see is that the media often frames sort of like the pathology of the situation to the individual. Meaning like sort of we'll sort of put, you know, there was racist writing and, you know, students are experiencing anxiety about that. And you think like, gosh, students are really anxious. And the pathology is in the community and the students are simply having probably a reasonable response to something really shitty. And yet we sort of place the pathology within and not where it really belongs, which is typically external to the individual because they're simply having a bad response to something that's bad. And so being thoughtful about that in terms of framing the people you're talking to, sort of in the context of what they're experiencing and not doing sort of shorthand about like, oh, depression and anxiety, and they're so depressed and anxious about this. It's like, they may just be having a reasonable response to something really terrible that's happening to them. So those are some additional framings and an additional couple of things I would add.
Definitely. And that kind of leads into our next question. And how can we report about these sensitive topics in a way that is both serious and authentic, but also hopeful and not just shocking or fear-mongering?
Yeah, an initial thing I would say is every coin's got 2 sides to it. And often my experience with the media is that it sort of tends to slant towards the negative side. What's gone wrong and what was bad and the negative impact. There is a reporter who I speak to regularly enough, and it's not your newspaper, but who I speak to regularly enough that I've been able to do like a little mini research study. And when I tell this reporter something, she usually calls with sort of like something bad on campus. What do you think? I've talked with her enough that when I tell her something bad, it makes the paper. When I try to re-spin it to her positively, she doesn't report it. And now, you know, it's happened enough that I've said to her, I want to give you a positive spin because every coin has 2 sides. And I know you're not going to print it because you don't print positive things. And now it's started to show up. And so that's something that I would keep in mind is sure, let's say, for example, our students are having levels of anxiety and depression because of everything that's going on. But what is also happening is our students are highly resilient. They are civically minded. They are the masters of accessibility of information and opportunity. And I think those things deserve to be printed as much as sort of the negative stuff or sort of the downside of things. And it's notable to me when that happens. So I think those are really important, especially in super sensitive, difficult topics or occurrences, that we talk about kind of the strength part of it and not just the weakness or the negative impact part of it.
Definitely. No, thank you for sharing.
I think once again, all of this kind of starts from the place of honesty and sincerity, both on your part, being honest and sincere about what you are seeking from your interview subject, but then putting them in a place where they are honest and sincere back to you. A lot of that is setting that up, maybe even before you get there, definitely before you turn on your recorder. In the case of Justina, we talked on the phone quite a bit. I'm going to ask you hard questions. I'm going to mine your memory. We're going to talk about that night. If you feel uncomfortable about those things at any time, you can stop this. You do not have to answer every question. A line I always say is, my job is to ask questions and your job is to answer the ones you want. Obviously, if we're dealing with government figures and stuff, I wouldn't say that, but we're talking about people sharing deep parts of their life, and that's just the plain truth about that. But as far as the writing, I just want to say a few things. In stories like these, we are looking for the bruise on the apple. We're looking for moments of change and moments of vulnerability. So in order to get there, you have to ask about before and you have to ask about after. So most of the time when you sit down, please tell this person, first of all, to cross off lots of time to be prepared, you as well, turn your phone off, be there, be live and be present. But you're gonna go way back before the incident that we're talking about. What was your childhood like? What kind of kid were you? What clique in high school were you a part of if you had to be a part of one? In the case of Justina, what I found out is that there was some domestic violence in her household. So her understanding of men has always been difficult. And how she interacted with men as someone who dated was difficult. I also found out this amazing detail about how when her parents were fighting, she'd take her younger brothers and sisters and climb up into a tree, and they'd just sit in a tree. So then as we start talking about the rape, I have a place in my mind where I know how she's feeling when that man enters her home. Then of course we're going to talk about that, but then we're going to talk about the after, and we're going to talk about coming through, or where you are in that process of coming through and what you hope to do. So when we approach victims or people that have experienced tragedy, hopefully you're not talking only about the tragedy. You're talking about before and after, because that's what a story does. The other thing to think about is that in this kind of work, all stories lead up to a revelation about life and the times we live in. So think about that as you're doing your interview. What is the revelation about life or the times we live in that your subject is telling you? And they're not they're not going to say the revelation about life from my story is X, but they will be telling you that throughout your interview. Listen to that. Ask questions about that. Frame what that is going to be in your story. I'm a columnist, so I get the privilege of basically being able to say that. A lot of times in stories, new reporters won't, but if you're thinking about that, you can collect details that will tell you that. You can collect quotes that will tell you that. You can reframe your questions before you get to the writing process so that you have an idea about the revelation of life or the times we live in. I also call this the universal truth. And the other thing is seek details. This is where it's hard if we're talking about details in tragedy. And this is where hopefully you've done a lot of that work to pave it so that people are ready to talk about that. But details are where connection happens. Details is where a story becomes a path to empathy, or a path to an open heart or an open mind. I was writing about a cold case, long story, I won't go into that, but I was writing about a cold case where a sister had her 2 younger sisters killed. So the survivor had 2 younger sisters killed in a car accident. And we talked about the funeral. And she talked about walking into the room and the look of the room and how her sisters were placed, and it was a small casket. And then she said they had Band-Aids from where the funeral director could not perfect the deformities to their face. They had Band-Aids. And I was like, what kind of Band-Aids? Like, stop, what kind of Band-Aids? And they were Winnie the Pooh Band-Aids. And that made it into the story. And 90% of the email that I received from readers were about those Band-Aids, because most people know somebody who wore Winnie the Pooh Band-Aids. Maybe they were us, parents who gave Winnie the Pooh Band-Aids for everyone, to their children. So all of a sudden, a story about a cold case that really has nothing to do with your life becomes something that you can find connection in. And if you can find connection in the Winnie the Pooh Band-Aids, you can probably find connection in what tragedy means. You can probably find connection in how she's getting out of it. And you can probably find connection in her story. So I guess that's what I would say. Seek details and prepare them to speak about their life.
That was really beautiful. Yeah. The Winnie the Pooh details. I used to wear Winnie the Pooh Band-Aids. So
Yeah.
there you go.
I have nothing to add. I think they summed it up pretty well.
Awesome. Well, we will start with you then, Tab, for our third question. And it's just, how can journalists and sources, readers that take in a lot of news that is sometimes hard to hear, practice self-care, but also remain informed?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this like idea of self-care for a while now. And I think it's more so, or maybe less about self-care, but more about a community of care. And so thinking about your friends, and how you have built a community around you that cares and supports you through any and everything is important. I think that, like this work, similar to my work, can be really difficult. And so if you're not getting poured into, it's going to be hard to do your work. And so finding folks and things that pour into you. Maybe it's a practice with people. Maybe it's an online community that you have, that, you're able to just be, and you're outside of your role in your work, and you're a human being. And so I think finding those spaces and places where you have that care is imperative, because we're humans, and I'm sure Barry can speak to this a little bit more articulately, but we are predispositioned to want to connect. And so we want that connection with other folks. And when I think about self-care, it's this selfish kind of one-off practice that we sometimes want to do, meditating, for example, or yoga. But what I think is more sustainable is having a group of folks or a community that supports you and lifts you up, in those moments where, you are just not in a place to do the work anymore, or do it effectively, or you need to be able to take a step back, and be poured into. So that's what I think.
I'll go, Barry. I saw you on mute. I'll go next. I think that one piece of advice I'd like to offer to journalists is get comfortable with not knowing about things. I don't know how many of you have seen that Portlandia sketch, Have You Read It? Where they're just like, have you read it? Have you read it? Have you read it? And there's this pressure to know every single thing going on. Separate yourself from that. It's not a bad thing to say, no, I have no idea what are you talking about? Tell me more about that. When I was a young journalist, that was like my greatest fear, that I would look like a moron because I hadn't read like the latest Atlantic. You know, you just can't know it all. So just let it go. Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I haven't read that. What's that about? Let it go. Your life will be a lot better, I promise you. But in that, then you can focus on the things you want to focus on and focus on what's imperative to your job. So if you are a crime reporter, maybe that is the line that you put, that you're going to focus the time and attention of your social media and of your soul on things that are about that. And so you can separate yourself from knowing everything that Trump tweeted that day. You know, you can find those different lenses. The other thing, being a journalist is about working all the time. I wish it wasn't, but it is. So you got to set your boundaries and relay those to your editors. So for me, for example, I work Monday through Friday, and I'll give you everything I got Monday through Friday. I'll work 16 hours a day if I've got to, but I don't work on the weekends, and I'm unavailable, save for emergencies. And I tell my bosses that, you know, that's where I draw those lines. That's where I find work-life balance. Also, working out is important to me. So most of the time I'm not going to be available till 9:30. If you need me, you have my cell phone number. Go ahead and call it. And making sure to set those things in your mind and then communicate them to people. It's like changed my life. Like, honestly, I learned that too late, and I wish I knew that much younger. Set your boundaries and communicate them to the people around you.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, I certainly agree with what Tab said about sort of seeking community of care, and me trying to relax and mellow out and take hot showers is not, that's not for everybody. Sometimes my sort of settle down thing is to sort of like talk to a lot of people and process my day and that kind of thing. So honoring your style for sure, I think is really critical. The other thing is, you know, in the field of psychology, there's a thing called secondary trauma. And what happens is the trauma that happened wasn't technically mine, but I get exposed over and over to other people's experience of trauma, and it becomes traumatizing. And it may not be the big T trauma that you had, but small T trauma still is traumatizing in some ways, especially if it's something I can't necessarily get away from. Like if I'm the reporter, if I'm the Black reporter covering kind of like Black anti-racist violence. The fact of the matter is, it's kind of like being the band on the deck of the Titanic. Like you're trying to sort of like keep it playing and make it seem like it's normal and everything's okay, but I'm clearly on the same ship as you, right? And so I think really sort of keeping in mind that just because I'm sort of in my role as reporter and I'm covering something doesn't mean it doesn't impact me as well. And so the impact of either primary trauma because it's your story too, but you're covering it for something other than yourself, or it's secondary trauma because you are over and over exposed to other people's experience of trauma is super real. And often what happens is we kind of then think like, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I behaving this way? Like, what's my problem? Why I got to keep my act together? And what we don't do is honor that these are sort of normal, natural, reasonable reactions to really difficult stuff. And so when I'm like in a bad mood all of a sudden, a couple of days in a row after covering a story, I might just acknowledge to myself, I think it's okay for me to be in a bad mood. Look what I've experienced. Or if, you know, I'm interacting with you and you're like, not your usual self, rather than me sitting in judgment with you of like, God, what was your problem? I might think, I wonder what you've been covering, or what you've been covering those stories. And I might offer you grace and lean in with patience and sort of make space for you. And so keeping that frame of trauma, secondary, primary trauma with the stuff that you all have to sometimes lean into, I think can be validating in and of itself, gives you a break, gives others a break, and lets you sort of step away from judgment about yourself or others and step into grace with each other as well as yourself instead.
Definitely. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's definitely like a good way to think about it. So we have a couple of individual questions, and then we'll open it up to the group. So hopefully if you have a couple of questions, throw them in the chat, and we will definitely get to those here before we end at 2. So The first individual question is for Courtney. So tell us a little bit about spearheading the Iowa Moines project for Iowa's USA Today network papers, and how did planning and executing such an emotional project work? And for those who are unfamiliar with it, it was a series of profiles on families and people who had died from COVID-19, and was published in a big package on the Register and in other papers.
DesMoinesRegister.com/Iowa Moines if you want to check some of those out. So at the beginning of COVID-19 in Iowa, we just had numbers and we didn't have names, and there's really no way to get that. You know, that's not public information. So there would come these social media posts, you know, a coach in Iowa City died of COVID-19, and it was like, swarm, get that story, because people want to connect with what it means to lose someone to something so scary that's in our air around us all the time. So that was kind of what it was in the beginning, and it wasn't sustainable. But then we started seeing in the Register obituaries from average people, from just everyday people, that started listing COVID-19. And we start seeing that this is in our paper. And what do we do about that? And it became very clear that we had to have we had to have a plan. We had to have a mission if we were going to cover these people. So I went to NYU, like you said, and I went to NYU in 2005. And I remember the gaping hole in the ground that was the World Trade Centers. They had football lights and they worked on it 24 hours a day. And I had to walk by it to get to the movie theater. And I was very interested in that time frame. And I read Portraits, which is the New York Times's famous stories of people who died in 9/11. And so I said we should do something like that. And I created a style guide, which was really that we were going to write about people's lives and not their deaths, because by virtue of being in a package about COVID-19 deaths, we're aware that they died of COVID-19. And we're aware of what that death means. It means they were probably alone. But we're going to write about who they were before that happened. So created a style guide rather than a traditional obituary. These are going to be slices of life. They're going to start with features leads. They're going to have first names. I mean, all those things that as journalists we think through. And then we started the research process, which was reading obituaries from the first death in Iowa to the day that we launched, and collecting those names and handing them out. Every single human who has a byline in the Des Moines Register wrote a piece for this project, and they just got a name and a link to an obituary, and they reached out to that family. And I have to tell you, 75% of people wanted to talk. And afterwards, after seeing the project, probably 90% of people want to talk. There was some pushback, I will say, from the staff, because, you know, we're busy, everybody's busy, or it wasn't everyone's thing. You know, we were asking people who are columnists about the Hawkeyes to call a grieving family, but it was mandatory, so they had to do it. But in response, I think everybody has come to me and said it was something that they really cared about, and something that learned about their craft from doing. My biggest lesson, I would say, from this, and I'm happy to answer more questions. I tried to give an overview of the project. My biggest lesson, I would say, from this is that you must be prepared to speak with the person you are calling. What I mean by that is you should write your questions, whether you hope that you're going to do the interview right then, or you're just going to set a time for the interview. Do not call people unprepared. Like, I feel as though that's basic, but I still had to say that to some of the people that worked on this project. Do not call people unprepared. Prepare your list of questions, be ready. And what that also means is knowing what you can know about your source. So really quick story, and no shade meant to this person if they ever find this on the internet. There was an obituary of an older white man who had been a professor at a local Bible college. He taught divinity. And I read this obituary, and it just was it wasn't doing it for me. Like, something was missing. It wasn't all there. And so I just Googled this man's name. And what comes up is blogs and statements from the various colleges he worked at and like personal testimonials on social media. This man was the Bono of whatever specific type of divinity that he taught. And that wasn't in the story. It was not in the story anywhere. And what had happened is simply that that person had not Googled their source before they made that phone call. Please know your source, have your questions, be ready before you're calling people. So that's the takeaway from this project, I think.
Definitely. No, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, and if anybody has any other questions like about the Iowa Moines project, definitely throw them in the chat. Our second individual question is for Barry. And we were wondering, what kind of coverage or lack of coverage do you see about mental health in media outlets that you wish was covered better? And I didn't specify this in our email to you, but I personally was curious about suicide specifically in mental health and how that coverage could be better. But if you want to talk about other things as well, that's fine too.
Ooh, big topics. Yeah, so I think the press, certainly on this campus, I think the coverage around mental health is actually really good. It's fascinating to me when I go to national meetings and other counseling center directors, and there's a giant group of us. I belong to an organization that has a membership of 1,000 other counseling center directors, so it's a really big group who talk regularly about like, how do you get the campus media and campus press to pay attention to campus mental health? And I think like, man, I got that problem. I think you all cover this really well. So I want to note that to start. I alluded to this earlier. I think we are slightly wanton and reckless, and it's not just the media, about our reporting of mental health on campuses. And we lean in too readily and too quickly to denote everyone is anxious and depressed. And when I actually go drilling into reporters to ask like, what's that based on? What data do you have that supports that? What you're talking about is a diagnosable concern. What is it you mean? They'll say, well, people are just talking a lot about stress. And I was like, well, then you should probably call it stress and not anxiety. Because what has gotten started is our students, and this includes all of you, you listen to the media. And when you're struggling and worried about stuff that is worrisome, and you're stressed out about things that are stressful, and you're feeling down in the dumps about things that are simply just depressing, you may simply be having a reasonable and normal, if not comfortable, reaction to what's going on. And then when the media tells us that you're anxious and depressed, you think like, oh, maybe I'm anxious and depressed. I thought maybe I was just stressed. And this reciprocal feedback loop gets going that's not based in sort of the data that we have. When I go looking at the data, and we have a really robust database nationally of campus mental health, we went and compared, this is based on tens of thousands of students across the country. We went and we looked at symptom reporting. Now, these are students who went to counseling, so keep that in mind. These are students who actually go to counseling, so it's a particular sect of student. We survey on symptoms, and it's based on millions of data points. And what we did is we compared depression and anxiety, reported diagnosable depression and anxiety based on those symptoms from January to May of last year to January and May of this year. You can see what dramatically different years those are and what happened between March and May in particular. Students reported no higher depression and anxiety during those two time comparisons. In fact, suicidal thinking went down. The things that went up were family discord and academic distress, but that makes sense. We all had to go home immediately, and we all had to sort of go online immediately. But students were not reporting higher levels. Reports of stress and difficult mood were still high, but they weren't any higher. In fact, suicide, as I said, suicide reporting went down. So what happens, I think, is that we hear students saying like, oh my gosh, this is really difficult and this is really tough. And the answer to that is, you're right. Does it mean you have a mental illness? No, the data is not bearing that out. You simply may be responding in an appropriate way to something that's really terrible, and it feels terrible. And so that would be a caution I would keep for all of us, is to be careful of the words we toss around, because it has set up a feedback loop where we're telling students, this is how you're feeling. And the students, when we ask them, say like, I'm not really feeling that way. I think I'm stressed out. But the media tells me I have high anxiety. Now, this is not to diminish those that are living with anxiety and depression. Please don't hear me say that nobody's having any difficulties along those lines, because people do. But broadly overall, we're simply not finding that. And so I think that's a really critical thing, especially now when things are really tough, that we're careful with how we throw terms around and what we mean by those terms, and to sort of make sure we also talk about how resilient and strong and bright and socially active our students are, and that they are not unidimensional folks who struggle only in the face of adversity.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I answered every one of your questions, but I think I got to them.
Yeah, no, I think that was great.
Can I say one other thing, actually, that prompted me? I want to say one more thing and then I'll stop. I appreciate the media's sensitivity around suicide. Typically, what doesn't get reported is when folks have died by suicide, the media has actually done a really good job not reporting that. We know about the contamination factor that comes with suicide. And for the benefit of reporting on a student having died by suicide, the risk of contamination far outweighs any potential benefit there may be. And so I've always been appreciative of the press not reporting on suicide. And what we do instead is we sort of, recall a student's life and not glamorizing it. What we tend to do is when a student somebody dies of suicide, we go and talk about like how wonderful they were and how great and how successful and what a tragedy and what a loss. And people listen to that. And it can be informative. So I've always appreciated the press's sensitivity on not reporting suicide. Now we can talk about suicide as a phenomenon and suicide prevention, but in the individual case of how someone died, it remains really critical that we not report on suicide, even if we talk about suicide as a campus problem or a campus phenomenon that we should do something about.
Definitely. No, definitely. Thank you for that insight. Okay, and then the last question for Tab, and sorry, we're kind of running a little out of time for other questions. But from a reader source perspective, what are ways for journalists to approach talking about race and identity, and when is it relevant, or how should we be asking about it?
Yeah, I'll be succinct. So if you all have some other questions, you'll have time. So, I've been thinking about this, and, I think about the answer from the perspective of you shouldn't, or not shouldn't. As a reader, I am perplexed when all of the stories on race and ethnicity are stories of pain. And so when we think about, people of color, they're not monolithic. And so there's diversity within those stories, within the folks who tell those stories, and the celebrations. When do we talk about or celebrate folks of color? When do we have opportunities to see that in the media? When folks are doing really awesome things, I think about, I was really excited to get a Daily Iowan for the election, right after the election. And it was cool to see Joe and Kamala. But what I think I would have loved to have seen was a story about Kamala, in a sense that we are celebrating our first woman, Asian American, and our first Black, vice president. That story would have captivated me as a reader, as a Black reader. I would have not been able to put the Daily Iowan down, but what you see is the story about Joe, which I get. He's just one president-elect. That blind or tone deaf, but I think this could have been supplementary. And a lot of times when we think about the stories that we're telling, they always seem to be when there's been tragedy. Black lives still matter today. And when's the last time we saw in the newspaper Black Lives Matter? Back this summer, and they still matter today. And so I'm just wondering, when will that come back around, when there's another crisis that happens? And that's unfortunate. And so I think thinking about the ways that we can celebrate heritage, celebrate histories, celebrate diverse perspectives, but also we need to realize, I think, where we enter the conversation. So I'm thinking about how, your newsroom is perhaps predominantly white, and how do you enter the conversation as a white person? You are not devoid of race. And so I think some work around that and understanding how your identity shows up in your writing, shows up in the way that you interview, and might come to an interview with a person of color with a deficit mindset, right? And so think about that, and doing the work around that is really important, because as a source, as somebody that has been the subject of a story, I feel that in the questions. You already kind of have a perspective of what I'm going to say and what my experience is before I tell you my experience. And so that needs to be kind of flushed out and developed a little bit more. I think understanding your identity and your perspective is key. And lastly, I would just say, thinking about going back to how race and ethnicity and racism is not new, is not some, and it's very pervasive. Is pervasive for real. And so how do you tell stories of that pervasiveness instead of just this one incident? How has racism impacted our institutions, our ability to have relationship with each other? How does it not build bridges? And think about it from a systemic way, and in addition to thinking about it individually. Because I think the truth, and when you, as a reporter, as a journalist, when you're trying to get to the truth and get to change and revelation and all of that, it's not just about the individual stories. We have a history in this country around racism that we do not talk about. So elevating that history, I think, is very important, because that then raises the level of consciousness and conversation for your readership. And then maybe some things can change. And that's all I got on that. So if y'all have questions, let me know.
I would just chime in really quickly and to heed Tab's call that, we shouldn't only turn to people of color to answer questions about people of color. That race is held by all of us. And I would really encourage all of you that when you are covering these stories, or you are creating these stories because you think there's something really important that should be told, nothing's particularly happened, but there's a story that must be told, that you reach out broadly. White people basically hold racism. That's where it is when we're talking about these things. And so when you are covering these stories, to be careful not to stereotype or to tokenize and do those kinds of things. It frankly, in trying to sort of upset the story, it basically perpetuates the story. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind.
No, thank you. Those were really good insights. And yeah, does anybody have any questions for our three speakers?
I'll ask a question. So obviously I've been a reporter at the DI since my sophomore year. And I've encountered a lot of sources that or when I'm talking about something sensitive, might start to get emotional, or at what point would you cut off a conversation, or maybe just take a step back? Or do you have any general advice for when individuals are talking about something that's obviously very meaningful to them, but you're kind of in a tough spot as a journalist, you want to write a story. So I guess how would you approach that that source, and how would you comfort them?
Sorry, I'll go quick. You are a human first, so I will tell you, it's not your place to cut them off if they're telling their story. That's what you've asked them to do. That's why you've asked them to be there. You can reach out. You can ask them if they want to stop, if they want some water. You can have tissues, various things on you to give people. Don't pretend like you're not watching someone cry in front of you. I mean, interact with them like a person who's crying in front of you. But you don't need to all of a sudden, I mean, there's not this layer of separation between you. You know what it means to cry, and you know how you would like to be comforted, but you're there to tell a story. So you keep asking questions, and you keep letting them tell you those things. And I will also say, while I've said all of that, and I believe that to be true, You do have to be willing to walk away. And there's a great podcast, Canary, by the Washington Post. It's like episode 4 or 5, so you got to go deep into it to get to it. But this woman has been reporting a story about sexual assault for a year. She's done the interview with the survivor. It's very deep. And basically the survivor calls and she's like freaking out. She's, really uncomfortable. And you hear this person say, it is okay. We don't have to do this. So while I would say to you, interact with someone like a human and keep letting them speak and keep encouraging them to speak, I would also say ultimately you have to be willing to walk away.
Does anybody else have any burning questions?
While you ponder questions and before we run out of time, I do want to make sure I get on the record to say I really do appreciate the DI. I think you all do a really great bang up job, and I'm sort of proud to tell other campuses that you're our newspaper. So I want to just make sure I say that to all of you.
Oh,
And I've not always felt that about every campus's newspaper where I've worked.
well, thank you. We appreciate that. Yeah, I guess one question I had to, are there any I guess this is more for Tab and for Barry, are there any stories that you're seeing on campus that you think should be told or that we might be missing?
I don't know that. I really don't know. So I'm gonna just throw this out there, but I wonder a lot about the isolation and the effects of the virtual environment on connection with folks from not just a student perspective, but also the community, the broader community. So like staff and faculty, like we don't get to have water cooler conversation anymore. And we don't see peers in the hallways. And so that has done something to our psyche, I'm sure. And specifically me, like it has, and changed the way in which I even interact on Zoom and how I'm always waving to people. Like that's a phenomenon. Like, what is that? And so I would love to see something about that, and not just about students, because even though you are a student newspaper, I think you have an obligation to tell the story of the entire community of the University of Iowa. At least that's my perspective. And so I think something around that for sure could be shared, or there's a story in that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I always look forward to these community chats and our like budget meetings over Zoom because I get to see people.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're in such giant market change. I think sort of just helping us predict and anticipate everything that's coming, and it's academic, it's social, it's financial, it's racial. I just think there's things coming down the pike that we're all trying to anticipate and figure out. Where if you're a person who likes to feel out of control and you really enjoy ambiguity, this is the best time in recent history to be alive. But I don't know anybody who likes either of those things. And so I think sort of helping with those sort of like larger kinds of things that are impacting all of us, I do think is so critical.
Well, thank you guys so much for participating in this community chat, and to everyone who came. This I thought was really awesome. I really loved hearing all of your guys' stories. And we are running up on 2 p.m. So I'll let people dip out if they need to. Do our 3 speakers have any final thoughts? If you'd like to share, go for it. Otherwise, we'll let people hop off.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Be good.
Yeah.
Thanks.